Otto von Bismarck, the man who oversaw the unification of Germany in the late 19th century, called politics the art of the possible. He's saying that you might have grand, lofty dreams, but you have to go with what's actually possible to achieve. I'd argue that that applies to many things in life, including car design. There's always a compromise with a limited budget and limited time. That was never more true than with the Citroën Visa. Born out of Citroën's bankruptcy in the mid-1970s, it was a modern car that was still clearly a Citroën with all of its innovative features. But just how did they produce such a competent car in such a short time? This is a Citroën Visa story. The Citroën 2CV could only be seen as very successful. Conceived before the Second World War, it was the perfect car for a post-war economy trying to rebuild. It was cheap and reliable transportation. It might be very successful, but by 1970 it was also very out of date. Citroën had restyled the car as the 1967 Diane, and there was also the Ami that had launched in 1961. This had added a few more years to the life of the car, but clearly Citroën needed something new and they needed to start from scratch. Robert Opron had investigated a new small car in 1965, the G Mini. This image came from a couple of years earlier. We don't have any images of the G Mini, but 4 years later the Bureau d'Etudes built on the G Mini work, so these photos might give a sense of the car Robert was trying to create. The new small car project was dragging its heels due to Citroën's finances, which weren't great. So much so, Fiat took a stake in the company in 1968. By this time, Citroën's new small car project had morphed into Project Y. Given Fiat was a master of building small cars, Citroën's Project Y was built around reusing as many parts from the 127 as possible, including the chassis. In 1973, though, Fiat sold their stake. Project Y had to be completely reworked, but there was no money to do it. Citroën had been hoping their new Wankel rotary engine would save the company, but it did just the opposite, sending the company into bankruptcy. There were hopes that a restructuring deal could be done that would make Fiat a majority shareholder, but French President Georges Pompidou barred the deal. After a protracted period where Citroën was in financial limbo, the French government forced a shotgun wedding with rival Peugeot, causing the birth of the PSA Peugeot Citroën Group. Their new partner agreed that Citroën was in desperate need of a new small car, so designers got to work converting the existing Fiat-based small car design to something that could use Peugeot parts. The project was named Voiture Diminuée, or small car, and it was unfortunately concatenated to become Project VD. Brits had fun telling Citroën's designers just how funny that name was. At the time of the PSA deal, Citroën were keen to tell the public it wouldn't lose its identity. They weren't just going to become a Peugeot rebranding exercise. But after their first new car, the Citroën LN, broke cover, it was clear it had a lot of parts from the Peugeot 104 Coupe, including the chassis. But then again, it was amazing Citroën had produced this car at all. It launched in 1976, the same year the PSA deal had been inked. To be fair, the Citroën-Peugeot agreement had looked like it was going to happen for a couple of years, so work had been ongoing since then. But it was still fast work given Citroën's previous financial problems had meant that several stylists and designers had been let go or fled to other car companies. The LN had a more powerful version of the venerable 2CV engine, now producing 600cc and married to a 4-speed manual from the GS. The Peugeot 104 suspension had been softened to make it more Citroën-like. There was a new Citroën dashboard, an interior with split folding rear seats, and a rear hatchback made it a practical car. In one fell swoop, Citroën had fixed their small car problem with something modern and desirable, and the company could be forgiven for instantly going back on its commitment to stay independent. The LN allowed them to pay the bills and keep Citroën's workers employed. And those Citroën workers were kept busy, something of a change from previous years. The LN was a popular little runabout, selling 350 cars every day. It might be slower than the Peugeot 104 due to its smaller engine, but it was a great deal more fuel efficient, something drivers struggling with high fuel prices certainly appreciated. The LN model name was another clever play on words. The Citroën DS, when spoken with a French accent, sounded like the French word for goddess, déesse. LN sounded like Hélène, the Greek goddess Helen of Troy, also known as Helena, and that's what the LN update will be called in 1978, the Citroën LNA or Elena. I'm sure all this clever wordplay was wasted on most car buyers, though they just wanted something inexpensive to get them from point A to point B, and the new LNA did that superbly with its slightly more powerful 650cc engine that was still very efficient. These cars were a good addition to the Citroën range, but they weren't replacements for existing cars. The three-door hatchback was too small compared to the 2CV, Diane or Ami. Maybe Citroën could design something based on the longer five-door version of the Peugeot 104. To save money, Citroën could also reuse the LN body, stretched a little to accommodate 5 doors. But this wasn't going to be simply a copy-paste job. There were real changes in the new car that Citroën called the Visa. The main one was the dashboard that showed Citroën hadn't lost its ability to push the ergonomic boundaries to find a better way to drive. The controls sat on what Citroën called a PRN satellite. The module, an evolution of the Citroën CX's controls, contained the essential controls for rain or pluie, road or route, and night or nuit. The goal was to make it easier to reach all the essential buttons without having to take your hands off the steering wheel, a typically Citroën single spoke affair that made it easy to see the dials dead ahead. On the right were heating controls that were linked to good size vents. It had an uncommon feature, but was actually quite useful, that the side vents could deliver outside air while the central vents heated the car. All of this was mounted to a black plastic dashboard, or if you plumped for the Super, something with a funky 70s pattern. The P part of the PRN satellite controls linked to just one front wiper that did its best to cover the whole windscreen, presumably a cost-cutting measure. Money was instead spent on modern features like electronic ignition, which Citroën billed as the most advanced of any car. The PRN controls might be more ergonomic and reviewers saw the benefits, but the indicators weren't self-cancelling and potential drivers may have got put off by the PRN's unfamiliarity on the test drive. The Visa used the same 650cc engine as the LNA, but the Visa Super used a 1.1 litre four-cylinder engine from the Peugeot 104 that took the 0 to 60 time down from a glacial 26 seconds to only 17 and boosted the top speed to just shy of 90 miles an hour. The Super was also available in exclusive Vesuvius Brown that might have been chic in the 1970s, but customers today probably wouldn't get very excited about. The two engines were very different. The 1.1 litre Peugeot four-cylinder was only 4 years old, whereas the 650cc flat twin had come from the ancient 2CV, and it felt it. The Peugeot engine was mounted transversely, as were many other modern engines, to save space, but Citroën's older engine had to be mounted longitudinally, and I'm not sure there's any other car that had this weird situation for its range of engines. But then, if it wasn't quirky, it wouldn't be a Citroën. The engine placement also meant two different steering packages, and both of them were a little heavy to manage at slow speeds. But the suspension at least was familiar. It was a carryover from the Citroën LNA, and that was no bad thing. Reviewers said it put many mid-range saloons to shame. The shape was very familiar to LNA customers, and it featured large bumpers like the 6-year-old Renault 5. It wasn't a shape that pleased Citroën designers though. They'd been hoping for something with much less drag than the Peugeot 104, but the Citroën Visa got an identical score, 0.41. That was pretty much a failure for a company that had produced the SM with a drag coefficient of only 0.26. The Visa replaced two aging cars in Citroën's lineup, the Ami and the Diane, although the Diane continued on sale for another 5 years. After all, if enough people were buying the car to make a profit, why stop given Citroën had money problems? But the Visa was Citroën's future direction, and its international name signalled the company's intentions to export. Soon it would start appearing on British roads with right-hand drive. As I mentioned earlier, back in the 1960s and early 70s, Citroën had been working on its own small car, Project Y. The original goal was to complete it by 1976, but the Peugeot merger had derailed those plans as Citroën needed a new car fast, so they decided to use the Peugeot 104 platform. But Project Y hadn't been completely abandoned, so in 1976, when the Romanian government came calling for a new small car, Citroën trotted out Project Y as something that they could use. Romania and Citroën created a joint company that launched the Allsit Club in 1981. This ended up being a bad deal for Citroën though. The Romanian government couldn't repay the money the French company had invested, so Citroën attempted to recoup some of that by importing the club back to Western Europe as the Citroën Axel, where it went head-to-head with Citroën's own LNA. On the plus side, the Axel was closer to Citroën's original small car vision, with a much better drag factor, lower rear loading, and an evolution of the PRN satellite control system. But with low build quality, only 60,000 cars were ever made. Another car that wasn't selling well was the Citroën Visa. In 1979, 90,000 cars were sold, compared to 212,000 Renault 5s, a car that was already 7 years old, and sales of Renault's hatchback jumped to 300,000 a year later. Citroën's Visa clearly needed renewing, but their designers were busy finalising the BX, so work on the Visa update was farmed out to coach builder Heuliez. For a very reasonable price, they made a few key changes that vastly improved the look. There was the new front treatment that ironically made it look like a modern Peugeot. The new black window trim made the glass look bigger. There were rubbing strips down the side that were both functional and gave the car a more defined look. The reversing lights were taken out of the rear bumper and integrated into the light clusters, a much more logical place to put them and probably cheaper and less likely to be damaged in a low-speed shunt. There was a larger 1.2 litre engine, again from the Peugeot 104, with the option of a 5-speed gearbox that gave the car more get up and go around town and 96 miles an hour on the open road. The public loved the changes and sales leapt with 179,000 cars produced in 1981. And there was more to come. Citroën wanted to take the Visa rallying. After all, the Renault 5 Turbo was creating a lot of buzz, so they put out tenders for motorsport conversions. One taker was Lotus, who took, would you believe it, the Lotus Esprit and put a Visa body on top. It was an interesting idea, but Citroën settled on a design that gave the Visa all-wheel drive. That was considered essential after the Audi Quattro's dominance in the early 1980s. While they waited for that car to be produced, Citroën rallied two-wheel drive cars. That would mean selling a homologation special to the public, so the 1.2 litre Visa Trophy appeared in 1981. But more interesting was the limited edition Visa Chrono a year later, with a 1.4 litre engine that got to 60 in 10.2 seconds and finally took the car over 100 miles an hour. It featured a revised dashboard, bucket seats and a rear spoiler. The Chrono was interesting, but it was a limited edition car with a name that spoke less about speed and more about being a clock. The Visa GT arrived in 1983 with a clear sporting name. It was a little down on power compared to the Chrono, but it still got to 60 in under 11 seconds, which was enough for young, hot-blooded, hot-hatch drivers, people like me if I'd been a bit older. Like the Chrono, it got a front air dam, rear spoiler and alloy wheels to set it apart. Inside there were new seats with headrests and the option of a sunroof. The split-fold rear seats and good fuel economy made it an attractive all-round package. There was also a special edition all-white GT Tonic featuring an instrument cluster similar to the Chrono. By 1983, Citroën had their all-wheel drive rally car, which meant another homologation special that appeared as the 1000 Piste, or 1000 tracks. All-wheel drive was allied to a 110 horsepower 1.4 litre engine that got to 60 in under 9 seconds. New models were coming thick and fast. That same year, Citroën launched an open-top, the décapotable or convertible, again styled with the help of Heuliez. It provided open-air summer fun, but the extra weight made it slower than the regular car. The Visa had supplanted both the Ami and the Diane, which finally ended production in 1983, and Citroën wanted to do the same for the light van version of the Diane, the Acadienne. They tried a halfway house solution with the Visa Enterprise in 1982. It looked like a regular Visa, but the rear seats were removed and the rear doors welded shut. Citroën made a proper replacement in 1984 as the C15. Van owners wanted the frugality and power of a diesel engine, so Citroën slotted in a 1.8 litre diesel from the BX. That larger engine meant reconfiguring the suspension and steering, which led to a wider track that required large plastic wheel arch panels to hide the change. To support the extra cargo weight, the C15 used the beefier rear axle from the Peugeot 305 estate. But the PRN satellite controls were gone, replaced with something more conventional, and finally self-cancelling indicators. The C15 would go on sale in the UK the following year as the Citroën Champ. The diesel engine also came to the Visa passenger car, expanding the range and making the car more versatile. And Citroën wasn't finished making it go faster. Peugeot's rally program had produced the popular 205 GTI, so why not cash in on its success with the same transmission in a Citroën? And so the Visa GTI was born with a 1.6 litre 104 horsepower engine getting to 60 in 9 seconds. Like the diesel, this large engine required a wider track, and so the C15's black plastic wheel arches were once again pressed into action, which added to the sporty drama. The GTI also borrowed the stalks from the C15 with a new instrument cluster. What's more, it was a cool 15% cheaper than the Peugeot 205 GTI. That's a lot of money, over £1,000 in the UK. But Peugeot's car had some key advantages. First, it looked better, to my eye at least. The Visa was also heavier with worse drag, which meant it was a touch slower. And the Visa felt unrefined compared to the 205 that had a much newer chassis. That platform was now 13 years old. It also had a high loading sill and too much of the boot space was taken up by the suspension. It's maybe not a surprise the Visa GTI was vastly outsold by Peugeot's GTI. But Citroën's GTI was still a good looking car with a lot more poise and panache than the original Visa. The rest of the range got the GTI's new dashboard and there was the option of electric windows and central locking. But the Visa was getting close to its expiry date. It still offered the 2CV's 650cc engine if you wanted a slow car, but with truly great fuel economy. The Visa bowed out in 1988. True to Peugeot's word, they didn't lumber Citroën with another warmed-over Peugeot. The replacement, the AX, would be unique to Citroën. It had been launched a couple of years earlier as a 3-door model, replacing the smaller LMA, but it would now do double duty in 1988 as a 5-door. That same year, the Peugeot 104 also ended production. It had served its purpose both as a practical hatchback for Peugeot and the basis for a car that had helped bring Citroën back from the brink. This wouldn't quite be the end for the Visa though. The C15 was still on sale and would go on to be produced until 2006. And also, a very strange thing happened. Some Chinese engineers imported a Visa to China in 1987, and with scant regard for copyright law, they made a blatant copy, showing it as the Wuling LZW7100 in 1989. The only major difference was the engine, a Chinese-built Daihatsu 3-cylinder. By 1991 they'd started production, and over the next 3 years built a few hundred cars. When the Visa launched, Citroën were digging themselves out of bankruptcy and rebuilding after years of underinvestment. When the Visa ended production, Citroën were on a much firmer footing. The BX was selling well and the CX was soon to be replaced by the XM. All of this was due in part to the success of Citroën's little car that could. It might not be the sexiest car of all time or the most innovative, but it did the job for many customers, both as an ultra fuel efficient town car with its 650cc engine or as a full-blooded racer as the GTI. and that understated success needs to be celebrated. If you want to see what was happening on the other side of the fence, there are videos about both the Renault 5 and the Peugeot 205 on the right. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.